Welcome to the NNCPPC Department of Parks and Recreation's celebration of Mental Health Awareness Week. Throughout the first week of October, join us for free virtual and in-person fitness classes, workshops, speakers, and trainings. Enjoy this interactive session where you will gain knowledge and tools on how to take care of your mental well-being. Be sure to share what you learned in this session with a friend or family member.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our rescheduled program from our celebration of Mental Health Awareness Week back in October. My name is Yolanda Galloway, and I am a Health and Wellness Coordinator with the Department of Parks and Recreation. Before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping items. You should see a microphone icon at the bottom of your screen, like you see here. You need to click this icon to mute yourself. We ask that you remain muted to limit any distractions throughout the program this afternoon. Next, I want to draw your attention to the camera icon. You will use this to turn your camera off and on. Please be mindful that when your camera is on, all participants joining us this afternoon will be able to see your screen. You have the option to keep your camera on or turn it off, but remember, we just want to minimize the distractions and focus on what's being presented to us today. Next, I would like to show you how to pin a participant. To do this, you will need to click on the Show Participants icon. In the Participants column, select the individual that you want to view on your screen, then click or tap the three dots icon to reveal a menu. From the drop-down menu, select Pin for Me. The pin participant becomes the focus in your view and only your view, regardless of the speaker. To unpin, repeat these three steps and select Unpin. Please note if you are in a web browser, the PowerPoint presentation might be smaller in a window at the top or bottom of your screen. Next, I want to draw your attention to the closed captions. You can now turn on live closed captions during the meeting. To do this, you'll click on the three dots for more options. Then you can scroll down and find the option that says Turn on Live Captions. Then you will start to see captions at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose to use this feature if you need it. The last icon is the chat icon. This will allow you to ask questions throughout the program. You'll type a question on the screen in the box that you see here, and it'll bring up this box on the screen. You'll put your comment or question in this box, and then you'll just hit enter. And we'll be able to see your questions or any comments throughout the program. We will take questions at the end. So please, whenever you think of a question or a comment, please put it in there and I'll be monitoring that chat box. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for the afternoon. Dr. Carol Ray has a PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in Interdepartmental Nutrition and a Master of Science degree from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University in Food and Nutrition. She is a 1983 graduate from Spelman College with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry. Dr. Ray grew up her younger years in Salisbury, Maryland, and she grew up her formative years in Greensboro, North Carolina. Currently, Dr. Ray is a behavioral therapist at a behavioral health company in Northern Virginia. For the past 2 years, she served on the board of directors for the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Prince William County, Virginia. Dr. Ray desires to tell a story in order to address the problem of criminalization of the mentally ill. Dr. Ray is a mental health advocate for those who have mental health conditions, as Dr. Ray herself has bipolar disorder. I want to welcome Dr. Ray, my fellow North Carolinian. Thank you, Dr. Ray.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yolanda. Before I begin, I want to thank you, Yolanda, and also Savannah Nielsen for helping me work out the kinks for today so that I can present today. And I also want to thank you, the audience, for coming in to view my presentation. So now I'm going to take myself off camera and focus on these slides that I have to present, and then I'll come back on camera for question and answer. Okay, so in the beginning, I'm going to tell you about my story. Savannah, could you put up the first slide, which is a slide of a hotel? Great, thank you. So it was June 2nd, 2011. I recall sitting on a bench outside of the lobby of the hotel where I was living, and this was in Fairfax, Fair Oaks, Virginia, Northern Virginia. And so I remember being covered in a sheet by the hotel staff. And I did see about 3 or 4 police officers going in and out of the lobby of the hotel. And then I saw in front of me, directly in front of me, a policewoman smiling, waving her hands at me, saying, "Come on." So when I saw her, I felt safe because the other police officers were men, but this lady I felt safe with. So I went towards her. And the moment I went towards her, I sealed my fate into the Fairfax County criminal justice system. I was handcuffed, arrested, and thrown into the police car. I was not placed in the police car, I was thrown into the police car. Next slide. Okay, and so that's a copy of the police picture of a police car that I was in. Next slide. And so this is the jail system. So I was jailed for 6 days without my medication, and I went downhill fast. I experienced reoccurring hallucinations and delusions. And so for many of you all who don't know about what hallucinations are, this is where an individual sees, hears, tastes something, or smells something that is not real. A delusion is where an individual has a fixed false belief about themselves. And so I had hallucinations about hell. My delusions were where I felt I could solve any problem in the world. So the sounds of jail scared the living daylights out of me. I constantly heard this loud sound, which I associated a hallucination with, but right now, or even now, I do not recall what the hallucination was, but it was just a most terrifying feeling. And so, as a result, upon my entry 6 days later into the Western State Hospital, I was unable to walk. The reason being is because in the jail cell, I was sitting in a fashion where most of the blood was cut from my knees to my feet. And so therefore the blood was not getting down to my feet, whereas I could walk. And so for the first few weeks in the hospital, I spent in a wheelchair. And so I had just drifted this far downhill. And this was due to me not having my medication. And I will talk about that later in the presentation. So what was my career before the arrest? Well, next slide. Okay, you can go to the next one. Sorry about that. That's Western State Hospital. And now this is good right here. But that was Western State Hospital. So at the time of my arrest, I was working at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And basically what I did, I marketed individual and prospective group ticket sales to potential patrons of the Kennedy Center. And you can go to the next slide. I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry. Next slide. And I have a Master's of Science degree in Food and Nutrition from North Carolina A&T State University. Next slide. And I have a PhD in Nutrition from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Next slide. Okay, so after completing my Bachelor's of Science degree, I worked as a junior staff scientist at an environmental agency in Rockville, Maryland, and it was called Dynamat Corporation. And so this is where my mental illness first exhibited itself. It first appeared through me having anxiety attacks at work. And it felt like when the attacks came on, I would faint, but thankfully I never did faint. And also it then progressed to me having racing thoughts. Next slide. Then suicidal thoughts. And the suicidal thoughts, this is a picture of a similar condo which I was living in. I was living on the 4th floor. And so every time I would go into that condo, I felt as though that I would fall off the ledge of the fourth floor. And in my mind, I would always think, what would happen if I jumped off of that ledge? So I told my mom about it, and she in turn told my uncle, who was a surgeon. Next slide. That's my mother, and Brenda D. Patsy Moore. And also she in turn told my great uncle. Next slide. And that is Dr. Parnell Avery. And he was a surgeon. And he told me, he says, well, you're going to have to see a psychiatrist. I know you don't want to hear this, Carol, but you're going to have to see a psychiatrist, take medication, and also move back to North Carolina where your mother's living. And this was the last thing I wanted to hear. I subsequently told my mother that I felt like a failure because I had to move back to North Carolina. So my mother immediately told me, I wouldn't feel like a failure up in that crazy city. If I had to, I would leave. And my mother was, next slide. My mother was a Southern belle to her heart. So she loved the South. So she hated the cities. So she was just trying to tell me it's better for me to move back to North Carolina where things are calm. Next slide. So during this time, my dad was living in DC. This is a picture of my dad, Mr. Chester Ray. He was living in DC, and he and my mother thought that it would be better for him to live with me for a period of time until I leave my job and move back down south. And that's what happened. I moved back and relocated to Chapel Hill. Next slide. And moved to Chapel Hill, and then worked at Mantech, also Mantech Environmental. Next slide. And so I stayed at Mantech, I would say probably about a year. Next slide. And actually, after I relocated to Chapel Hill, my mother sought out a psychiatrist for me, and he actually diagnosed me with having obsessive neurosis, now known as obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is where an individual exhibits repeated actions in order to feel normal. An example would be constantly or repeatedly turning the light switch on and off. And so after a few months, I began seeing another doctor who was a psychiatrist, and I was seeing him for depression. And so while I was completing my PhD, and after completing my PhD, and also after getting my PhD, I was being treated for depression. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide, please. And after I graduated with my PhD in nutrition, I taught at the college level. I taught anatomy, biology, and also physiology. And I taught this at Sojourner Douglas College in Salisbury, Maryland. Next slide. And then I worked as a project coordinator at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore in the Department of Physical Therapy, and that was in Princess Anne, Maryland. Next slide. And subsequently, I worked as a senior research program coordinator at the Johns Hopkins Center on Aging and Health. And also during this time, I felt that I was at the top of my game. I was in a management position at one of the top universities in the country, which was Johns Hopkins. But I was very unhappy. I disliked my job, and I disliked being a supervisor. So after working at Johns Hopkins, I accepted a position as executive director of an agency in DC. Next slide. And this is the building where the company was located. This is the building where the company was located. And I worked in an office with other businesses and was the main employee at my company in this office. And it was very isolating, and there were few people to mingle with throughout the day. And so I fell in a mental crisis. And this was when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Okay, so how did I get to the lowest point in my life? Jail. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so how did I get to the lowest point in my life? Well, I met a lady while I was in Fairfax, Fair Oaks. I met a lady at a church that was located in Fairfax, Fair Oaks, and she told me that she had recently gotten over from having depression, and she told me, "You never know, God can prevent you from getting your medicine, thereby getting you off of your medication." And I told her, yes, but I need my medication. And a few days later, I was visiting my parents in DC, and I tried to refill my prescription. Next slide. That's where she said about me getting off of my medication. Next slide. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I went to visit my parents in DC, and I tried to refill my prescription, but the pharmacist said there was a glitch in the membership portion of my insurance. So I asked her, "So you cannot give me my medication?" She said, "No." I did not get angry because in my mind, that statement, what the individual said, you never know, God may get you off of your medication. That stuck with me. Her statement stuck with me. And also, I felt healthy, which was a double whammy. I did not tell my parents that I could not get my medication because I thought it would be too much for them. I had four prescriptions at about $200 each. So I knew it would be too expensive, although I'm sure they would have paid. So after visiting with my parents that weekend, I went back to the hotel where I was living. And on June 2nd, 2011, I woke up with hallucinations and delusions. So I was hot and I walked out of my hotel room unclothed, and I walked into the hotel lobby to ask for my key because I was locked out. And I noticed that the hotel staff were acting very strange. They were acting slowly and they were staring. So I got angry within because they were not moving fast enough. So I stormed out of the hotel lobby and walked down a tree lined street leading from the hotel. And one of the staff followed me saying, ma'am, please stop. And he said that about 5 times. And I knew that if I did not stop the fifth time, he would clobber me. So I sat down and began crying on the uh, side of the street. And he told me it will be all right. And this was little comfort for me at the time, though. And so he guided me back to the kitchen where the staff normally has their breaks. And they called for the ambulance, but the police arrived instead. And this was when I was arrested in jail without my medication. So 6 days later, I was entering into the Western State Hospital. Thank you so much, Savannah. Yes, you can go ahead and go to the next one. There we go. Thank you so much. So I entered the Western State Hospital. I recall when I was lying in bed and sleeping, I would see nothing but fire. And so I was in bed most of the time for the first few days that I was there. And all over my body, I just felt immense heat. And I was so hot that I picked out all of my hair. I literally felt scorching heat all over my body. Yet I did not feel any pain while picking out my hair. And I didn't even know I was picking out my hair. After my recovery in the hospital, I looked into the mirror and I asked the staff, what happened to my hair? And she said, you picked it out. And I said, all of it? She said, yes. I was so surprised to hear this because I did not remember, again, picking out my hair, and I was literally bald. Even though I studied science and worked in research, which requires an analytical mind, I had lost all rationality to this. And also, this is what a mental illness can do without proper treatment, such as medicine, as in my case. While in the hospital, I had a true healing over time. I was in hell, but my parents were in hell too. While I was living in Fairfax, Fair Oaks, my dad called me every day. Before my mental illness, if my dad could not reach me on the cell phone, he would call me on the hotel phone. And so when he could not reach me on my cell phone, again, he would, oh, next pick slide. Yes, that, okay, thank you. So when he couldn't, reach me, he would call me on the cell. Well, when he couldn't call me on the cell, he called the hotel staff, and that's when they told him that I had been arrested. And so they wasted no time and came to try to find out where I was. And so my mother contacted the Fairfax County Police Department, and somehow she eventually spoke to the public defender, my lawyer. And my lawyer at first would not tell her that I had been arrested. And also because I told her that I did not want my parents to know that I was arrested. So she was just complying only to my request. But as my mother pressed her, my public defender eventually did tell her I had been arrested. Yet by this time, I was in Western State Hospital, and my mom and dad had to track me down to find out where I was. They did not know if I were dead or alive. And also, I could not imagine how they felt. I can only try to imagine that, but I can only imagine how they felt. I recall my roommate receiving a visitor one day at Western State Hospital, and all I could think of, I wish I could have my parents, visit me, but little did I know, they did not know where I was. And so my mom contacted Western State Hospital and spoke to the social worker. And the social worker would not give her any information about me, mainly whether or not I was in the hospital or not, because of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is an act that protects one's privacy. And so my mom is a former news anchor out of Atlanta, Georgia. And I tell you, that anchor came out in her that day. She told me later that she told the social worker that she would go to the news and tell them that my daughter was lost in the criminal justice system in Virginia. Needless to say, the social worker called my mom back the next day and told her that I was at Western State Hospital. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, let's see. Okay. Can you go back for a second? This is a picture of my second mom, actually. And so this is the one who was a news anchor who was fighting on my behalf. And so anyway, after my parents found out where I was, they came to my bedside the next, I would say probably 2 days later, because they were coming from out of town. And it was such a bright, shiny day. And I recall that my mom was smiling at me and my dad was looking at me through his concern, but he was smiling. And I don't recall saying or doing anything but smiling and telling them that I am fine after they asked how I was doing. And so my parents conveyed to me that they really loved me, and this was the motivation that I needed to get well. So while you can go to the next slide. So while I was in the hospital, everything was geared toward getting the patients well and getting them discharged. And the hospital staff were very nice and nurturing. And I met 3 other patients who were I consider were my friends in the hospital, and they taught me how to dance again. And I recall that we were a tight knit group of girls, and I recall one of the staff saying, "They are like a sorority." And hearing this made me happy. All that me and my friends, my 3 friends, and every other patient wanted was to get out, get well, and get discharged from the hospital. And I would say, I would constantly hear the patients say, "I'm ready to get out of this place." Next slide, please. Thank you. While in the hospital, the patients and myself were confined to one floor. We could not freely go outside, and when we were allowed to, we were allowed to go outside, but it was also monitored. We couldn't go out by ourselves. And I would say probably maybe once or twice a day we would go out. And it was a fenced area with some concrete, some grassy area. Also had a small basketball court and 2 picnic tables. Our basic routine while I was in the hospital was resting, eating, taking our medication, talking to other patients, looking at TV, coloring, drawing, writing, and going to educational classes where we learned about the criminal justice system laws in Virginia and as it related to mental illness, and constantly learning the importance about taking our medication and how to navigate regulations at the Western State Hospital. This was truly downtime. It was a break from the hustle and bustle of life, which at the time was what I needed. And so this was a routine. This is basically a routine that allowed me to fully recover. Next slide. So then it came July 4th, and we had a picnic outside. I had a hot dog and potato chips. Once I bit into the chips, I sensed a sigh of relief. I immediately thought, this is what I had when I was at home. Of course, I was not at home. Next slide. And so the hospital staff was very caring. I recall on this day, same day, that one of the hospital aides told me, Carol, I told you to grease your hair. She said, this is the only way your hair will grow. I told her, okay. I immediately thought, this is what my mother told me when I was growing up. This time, for this reason, I listened to the aide. From there, I greased my hair, and as time went on, my hair grew back. I'd like to read an excerpt from my book, which is a poem I wrote about the hospital staff that cared for me. The poem is entitled, You Brought Me Back to Life. You brought me back to life. When I was down and out, you were there for me. You took care of me when I was in the raw. When all of it was seemingly freaking you out, you had no fear of helping me. Yes, you brought me back to life, and for this, I am so grateful. As we recovered, we were given additional tasks to complete. And thank you. Oh, and I also want to thank the hospital staff at Western State Hospital. This is to you. Okay, getting back to what I was getting ready to say. Okay, so as we recovered, we were given additional tasks to complete. And so an example would be running a washing machine and washing our clothes. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it right there. Thank you. Okay, so anyway, thinking back on my time in jail and in the hospital, I wanted to get out. And so to get out of jail, to get well, and then also get out of the hospital. And most of all, I wanted freedom and wanted things to be the way that they used to be in my life. Yet this was not to be. Actually, my life would be better, but different. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so my discharge date finally came. It was July 20th, 2011. Yet at discharge, I had another hurdle to cross. I was in class when my favorite nurse came and told me that you're being discharged. I immediately thought, I am gaining my freedom. I felt relief. She said to me, I will walk you to the discharging area. I was elated. As I walked into the discharging area, I saw a patient who was being admitted into the Western State Hospital. All I could do was to pray for him that he would be okay. There was another patient who was being discharged with me. As we walked into the discharging area, I saw two Fairfax County deputies. Next slide, please. Thank you. I saw two Fairfax County deputies. The moment I saw these deputies, I felt tremendous fear. One of the deputies was standing, the other one was sitting on a sofa. The deputy that was seated looked so mean. I could tell by looking at him that he was no happy camper. As the deputy stood up, I prayed that he would not process me. Then I saw the other deputy who was standing. When looking at him, I could tell he was a kind deputy by nature. The unhappy deputy processed the other patient, and the kind deputy processed me. The deputy who was working with me told me to turn to the wall. He told me to lift up my left leg, then my right. I realized that he was shackling both of my ankles. As I realized this, I looked at the nurse and director of the unit. Tears began to flow down my cheeks. The director told me as I looked at him, it's almost over. When he told me this, I thought to myself, how can it almost be over? I'm going back to jail again. I thought I was free, but it was not yet to be as of yet. The deputy asked me to turn around to him, and he cuffed my wrist to my waist. I recall telling the deputy, "Please don't cuff me too tightly. I'm claustrophobic." He smiled and showed me that I was not handcuffed too tightly to my waist. As he smiled, and I smiled through my tears. As I looked outside of the door, when the deputy was shackling my ankles, I saw an SUV, which I thought we would be transported to jail. I felt relief. I thought at least we are not will not be transported in the police cruiser. The reason being is because it's a tight back seat, and as a result of being in jail, I had an issue with being in tight spaces. And by this time, I felt I had claustrophobia due to, again, being in a small cell and also being shackled. So the deputies escorted me and the other patient. Please turn to the next slide. Next slide. This is a similar picture of what the paddy wagon looked like. So once in the paddy wagon, me and the other patient smelled a foul stench in the air. And the other patient commented on the smell negatively, but I told her, let's think positive. She did not respond. As it was a sunny day, it was a bright sunny day, and I thought I could look through the circle window from the back of the paddy wagon, thereby, being comfortable being transported. Yet the deputy put a checkered flap over the window, shutting out most of the light from the sun. Before the paddy wagon moved, I had to tilt my head downward in order to stay calm and not get anxious. My biggest fear was that I would relapse and be readmitted into the hospital before leaving. As I held my head down, I prayed and prayed hard. At every mile marker, the other patients said how many miles we were from Fairfax County. It took us about an hour and a half to get back to the jail. Once we drove into the garage portion of the jail, I immediately knew that we were there. I felt the humidity as I did 6 weeks prior. And then I felt immediate fear. Okay, change to the next slide, please. Thank you. The other patient, now inmate, and I were escorted to the lobby area of the jail. We each were handcuffed to the chair where we sat. There was a police officer who was carrying our medication in clear bags. He sarcastically said as he carried the bags, "Wow, this is a drugstore." Once I heard this, I recalled saying to myself, I am going to put his statement in my book, and I did. Then there was another police officer who was very nice, escorted me to the women's portion of the jail. Once I arrived to the women's portion of the jail, I met a nice female officer. She said while smiling, "Hi, Carol, you're looking good." I thought to myself, how does she know me? Then I thought she must have seen me in the jail 6 weeks prior. Next slide. Okay, and so I asked, before going into the jail cell, because I had to spend the night, before going into the jail cell, I had to see me, and he asked me, "How long are you staying with us?" And I told him overnight, and that is what the previous person who told me I looked good, the police previous deputy told me. She told me I would be spending the night. He looked at me with doubt, and I said under my breath, "I am getting out of here tomorrow by the grace of God." And so anyway, I had to spend the night in jail, and there was a lady while I was in jail the first time who was a few cells down from me, and she would often say, "Help me, Jesus." And so when I got back to the jail cell, I was on her floor, and she said, "Help me, Jesus," and she was still there. I said to myself, I cannot believe she is still here. Where is her family? and then I immediately thought, I thank God for the support of my family. So who knows, she may still be there. I have no idea. So while in jail, another clinician conducted a mental health assessment. You can go to the next slide. Okay, that's where I had to spend one more night. Okay, hold on for 1 second. Okay, so anyway, while in jail, I had another clinician to assessment. He told me, I'm afraid to tell you, but you have had bipolar disorder all along. I was shocked. I have been treated for 24 years, and in the 24th or 25th year, I learned that I have bipolar disorder. Okay, so before leaving the hospital, it was impressed upon me to take my medication and take it on time. Please change to the next picture. The next slide, please. Okay. Change to the next slide. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so um, let's see. Okay, you can change to the next one. Okay, we'll go ahead. Anyway, so before leaving the hospital, it was impressed upon me to take my medication and take it on time. But each time I asked for my medication while in jail, the officer said the nurse is not on the floor. And so I did not take my medication on time that night. That night, I almost lost my faith. And so immediately my faith kicked back in. I knew everything would be all right. I did not sleep soundly while I was in jail. I may have had only about 10 minutes of rest. Can you go back to where you see breakfast? There are pancakes on the picture on the slide. There are pancakes, and I think they may have sausage too. Maybe going backwards.
Your screen may be a little delayed, Dr. Ray. We can see it. Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Savannah. Okay, so let's see. I awoke the next morning with the inmates saying breakfast, breakfast. I was so excited to get breakfast because the night before, I don't even think I ate. Maybe I ate a sandwich or something. But anyway, I woke to them hearing their voices, and I thought the food would be good. When I opened the tray, there were pancakes, sausage, and syrup. And I said, great. I poured the syrup onto the pancakes only to taste that the syrup was very bland. It had no taste. I bit into the pancakes. They were cold and rubbery. I bit into the sausage and it was cold. Therefore, I did not eat. I just put the tray aside. Then I lay back down and dozed off to sleep again. I awoke to hear a female police officer calling my name. She said, "Carol, are you ready to go to court yet?" I said, "Yes." Then she took one look at me and says, "I will give you a minute." I said, "Okay." About 10 minutes later, a beautiful Latino female police officer came to my cell. She looked like an angel. I wanted to so badly tell her this, but I did not want them to think I had relapsed. She told me, "You look good." I told her, "Thank you." It felt bittersweet. I thought to myself, it did not have to take all of this. Yet I thought, I am closer to release. Can you change to the next slide? And the next slide. There we go. Thank you. So, but as I walked to court, I prayed that the court case would go well. So when I walked into the courtroom, I looked for my parents, but they had not yet arrived as the time of the court proceedings. Then I prayed to God that he would touch the judge's and my lawyer's heart. I was facing charges of indecent exposure. After my lawyer spoke, the judge set my bail at $100. All I could do was to thank God for having my bail reduced from $500 to $100 by the judge. Then my lawyer walked over to me and said, "You look good. You look good." I told her thank you. Again, it was bittersweet. My case ended in a no pros, which is better than a dismissal, I'm told, which means that the prosecutor will no longer prosecute. Next picture. Yes. Okay. And next picture. Thank you. So then I was escorted back to the women's portion of the jail in handcuffs to go back to the cell. The police officer told me, "It may take a few hours, but you are leaving today." I smiled and said, "Thank you." Next slide. Okay. Thank you. Finally, the female police officer escorted me to where I was fingerprinted and my picture taken, my mugshot. When the officer taking my picture said, "Smile," I did not want to smile, but I did. Then the female police officer told me, "It's almost over." Next picture. Okay. She escorted me to the exit doors. She pointed and said, "See, after you go through those doors, you are free." That's all I wanted to hear, free. I told the officer, "Thank you for taking care of me." As I walked through the double glass doors, I was as concerned if my parents would be waiting for me. As I walked through the doors, I saw my dad, mom, and aunt, my dad's sister, sitting. Then I smiled, and to my joy, they smiled. I hugged them all, and I was elated. Before I walked through the double doors, my dad later told me that he told my mom and aunt that will say thank you to the officer. Then when I actually walked through the doors, he heard me say thank you to the officer. I think by him hearing me say this to the officer, he felt a burden, as if a burden was lifted. As my dad drove from Fairfax jail into DC, next slide. Oh, that's my dad and my mom and me and my dad's sister. Next slide. Okay, so as my dad drove through from Fairfax County Jail into DC, I looked at the statues and monuments and thought, this is freedom. All I could do was to thank the Lord for my freedom. Then I thought, if only President Obama knew what I went through. But then I immediately thought, God knows what I went through. That's all that matters. And most importantly, I have my freedom. Next page. Thank you. So after my ordeal, I was a changed person, literally. My life had changed forever. I was more empathetic, more caring, and identified more with the simple things of life. I was stronger mentally. I knew I had to take my medication more than likely forever, which was okay for me. Additionally, my occupation had changed forever. I knew I had not worked since I knew I could not work a 9 to 5 job mentally like I had before. And also, I was a caregiver for about 5 years, and I was a trainer for about 2 years at a home health agency. And then there was one addition to also that I began working as a behavioral therapist in 2018, and now my occupation has changed. I'm in the process of opening up my business in the greeting card business industry, and also I did write my book. I'm pushing my book also and doing speaking engagements. And basically, that's all that I have. If you all have any questions, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you. Oh, sorry, that's right. Oh, thank you so much. I wanted to just go ahead, and I did after the a couple of years after the arrest, go in and through NAMI to tell my story at CIT trainings. Okay. And could you do the next slide? Okay, I did speak into the community. This is my aunt who passed actually in 2000, I think it may have been 16. And she was the one who told me I should write a book. And the next day I picked up the pen to write the book. And next page. And that is a copy of my book, and it's available on Amazon. Now I'm finished. Thank you.
Awesome, Dr. Ray. Thank you for sharing your story. We really appreciate it and sharing information about the system and how you were able to overcome that. And at this
Thank
time,
you.
there are no questions in the chat box, so we'll give
Okay.
folks a moment to either comment or ask any questions. But again, we appreciate you being a part of our week of activities and getting the word out and sharing your story with us and others.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So no questions, but someone said thanks for sharing. Yes, we do
Oh,
appreciate it.
wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you for
sharing.
joining.
So we do have a question. What tips do you have for individuals trying to help friends and family who are experiencing mental illness? How can we best support them? Thank you for that question.
Yes, I would say just being there, even if you're just standing beside them, just let them know that you care. Ask them, is there anything that you need? And if so, what is it? Just being open and trying to develop a dialogue in the sense of how you can care for them, basically letting them know you care about them. And that will open up the trust issue because that's basically what it is that they have to trust you through this whole thing. So building that trust is a key.
And then another question came in or comment said, this is awesome. And this person asked, don't you feel the system failed you? Why were you arrested instead of just hospitalized and evaluated? Great question.
Well, that's a very good question. Yes, I do feel as though that I fell between the cracks because I did not get my medication. One thing is the pharmacist. Oh, and I forgot to tell you all that it was a glitch in the membership portion of my insurance. Well, I called my insurance company to get that straight so it wouldn't happen again. I called them and they said there was never a glitch in the membership portion of my insurance. And I had re-enrolled 2 to 3 weeks earlier. So she may have been looking at somebody else's prescription. I don't know what
Oh,
happened with
wow.
that. Yeah. But
Wow.
I see that I had to go through this mainly because it was a godsend. Some of you all may not think so, but I just do believe I had to do that in order for I can be a voice for the voiceless, but then also, promote mental illness and how serious it is and how it's a stigma in society. Now, as
Mm-hmm.
far as the police officers, yeah, I could have gone to the hospital, but you see, thing is that way back then they did not have something called CIT, crisis intervention team training. So the officers who came to me, they did not have obviously any training in that. And so the only thing that they knew was to arrest me. They didn't have, I don't know if they thought that they could take me to the hospital. I don't know their thinking on that, but obviously they were not trained properly.
That's a great point that you bring that up. And I appreciate how you put the years on your slides because that kept sticking out to me and remembering, how things have evolved. Although we're not where we want to be, things have
Right.
evolved in resources and training for dealing with individuals with mental illness, giving them health care versus,
Yes.
the criminal, criminalizing them. Um,
Yes.
one other
Oh, and
person,
did she ask me what was I arrested for?
she said, yes, why were you arrested instead of just
Okay.
hospitalized? Hmm.
Yes, I was in indecent exposure because I walked out of my hotel room unclothed and I didn't even realize I was unclothed. I had drifted just that far without my medication as a result of being turned away from getting my medication.
Thank you for sharing. And then this is a great question. They said they were a little late, but however, what was the trigger to set you on your recovery? Was it your jail experience or was it something else that put you in that place of recovery? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Actually, before leaving the hospital, they put you on the medication. They stabilize you, number one. And then I went to an out, I don't know if I went to an out, I know, let's see. I'm trying to think if I went to an outpatient facility because that's what happens a lot of times. It would set me up with my doctor and therapist. So what happened, I knew I needed to be in some type of situation where I will stay on my medication. So a lot of times what they do is put you on, your regimen of the medication and then set you up with a psychiatrist and a therapist. And I knew that I did not want to go through that again. And I had drifted just that far. And I still know that if I don't take my medication, I could end up there again. And that's one thing I don't want to do.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
that's keeping me on that's keeping me straight.
Mm-hmm. So a person asks, what can a parent do when the bipolar patient refuses to take their medication?
Yeah, I would actually, if you can, seek the doctor's help. And basically, you can also I'm wanting to know if they're able to read about bipolar or mental illness. If they're able to read about it, the parent is able to read about it and let them know that they will go downhill if they don't take their medication, and that they want to remain normal. I hate to say normal, but they want to remain stable, they need to take their medication.
Okay. Thank you for that. Great
Hmm.
questions. Great
Yeah.
discussion. Right. Awesome. Well, that's all that I see in the chat box. Thank you all so much
Okay.
for joining us. Again, thank you, Dr. Ray. We
You're welcome.
appreciate the questions, the comments. And
Okay.
we have one person that said you went a long time without being diagnosed. What are some of the symptoms of bipolar that were maybe overlooked? Okay, we do have a little extra time, so we do have that
Okay.
question. What are some of the
Yes.
symptoms of bipolar that were maybe overlooked?
Okay. So what would have been overlooked, I would say, would be my highs and my lows. With bipolar, it's just like a wave. You go up and down, up and down. But I think the doctor, and with that, with one sitting, you would not know that. The doctors would not know that in one sitting, because when I first saw my doctor, it was like in the initial time I saw the doctor, which was like out 45 minutes up to an hour. And at that time, I was being treated for depression. I saw him for depression, treated for depression. And in one sitting, the bipolar would not show up, meaning that you have a high and a low. It goes high is mania, low is depression. And so if the doctor sees that in one sitting, which he probably won't, but if the doctor sees that in one sitting, maybe he could classify that. There is this manual out there. I think it's called the DM something manual, and that's what doctors look at in order to diagnose a mental health condition. And so they could have looked at that, but I think that would be hard too. It's easier, in my thinking, that they would look at bipolar in more than one sitting. And when I mean more than one sitting, I'm talking about episode, them having an episode. So hope I answered your question.
Thank you for that. Don't want to
Hmm.
cut anyone off. This is some good stuff. And that person who asked the question said, "Thank you so much for sharing your story, Dr. Carol. I will look for your book."
Oh,
Um,
wonderful. It's on Amazon. Thank
and
you.
we do have one here. Can bipolar be cured? Are you born with it? Is it caused by trauma?
It is actually, well, you know what? Well, I'll tell that in a second. But I think it's just a condition. It's more so like a chemical imbalance. And so, if you have a chemical imbalance, you have to have that chemical balance treated like with medication, I believe, on my end. They do have it such when there is my high, what is it? I think with the high, there's something called neurotransmitters, and neurons are something with neurotransmitters. I have to look at that a little bit closely and understand that a little bit better. But dopamine is involved in that, and that's when there is a lot of dopamine, and that is the high. And then the low, I think, is serotonin. And so when you have the least serotonin or more dopamine, then that's when the bipolar condition occurs. But a lot of times it's just a chemical imbalance.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, we do have a few more minutes, so I do want to let people get their questions in. If you're able to answer, I know a lot of these are medical questions and it's
Yeah.
really around your
And I'm not a
experience.
medical doctor, okay, y'all. I'm a
Right.
PhD.
Are depression and bipolar symptoms episodes similar? And just with your experience, you may be able to speak to this, but are depression and bipolar symptoms episodes similar?
Now, can you repeat that?
Are depression, so
Mhm.
depression and bipolar with the symptoms and episodes, is there some similarity with that?
You know what? I don't know. I just
Okay.
know I really don't know, and I don't want to feel comfortable in saying. I
I
think you may want to
understand.
ask your doctor on that.
I understand. Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks again.
You're
Good stuff.
welcome.
Good
You are
stuff. So
so welcome.
interesting.
Well, I'm so glad. Hope you're pleased, Yolanda.
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, it's all about, getting the word out, you sharing your story and your experience.
Okay.
And so that will allow people to even look more, dig deeper, be able to share
Okay.
information with their family. And that's really what that week was all about and what today has been all about. So thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Well,
So
thank you so much.
you're welcome. Thanks. So we have just a few announcements before we let you go to enjoy the rest of your Friday and begin your weekend. This program has been recorded, so it's available upon request. You can email us at wellness@pgparks.com to get a copy of the presentation if something you want to share with your family or friends, or just go back and listen in on some of the parts of Dr. Ray's presentation. And then we want to invite you with the Health and Wellness team. We celebrate something we call Healthy Holiday Nutrition Series. We like to provide information to our residents and opportunities for them to learn about cooking demos and nutrition around healthy holidays, right? To be able to cook those traditional meals in a healthier way. So if you would join us, our next session is holiday peas and mashed cauliflower on November 9th, and that starts at 6 p.m. And you can register at pgparksdirect.com if you look up that information. But we can send you an evaluation, and we'll be able to provide information on how you can register for this program coming up next week and others for the month of November and December. Okay. So we thank you and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Mental Health Awareness Week. For more videos and offerings throughout the week to help you take care of your mental well-being, visit the Health and Wellness webpage at wellness.pgparks.com. Until next time, be healthy, be well.